Hey everybody, this is Nick from Nick's Listening Space, and today we're going to talk about the Aiyima T20. So I was really excited to review the T20 because I just love preamplifiers, or I don't really know, maybe it's just the idea of them, or maybe it's them acting as a hub or the system managerial role that they assume. But in the past I've talked about how these affordable tube preamplifiers could possibly be introduced into your system and be used to add a little bit of color. So there's a way, I think, to create a more dynamic listening experience simply by getting creative with how we hook these up. And at least for me, I'm very interested in how devices like this can be used to help create a more dynamic or even a more multimodal system. Or, rather maybe a system with various stems coming off of it, each with its own flavor. And so, to start this off, the T20 is a bare bones preamplifier with tubes, swappable op amps, all for around $200. And with that, you get both XLR balanced and RCA inputs. Now at this price point, we have to be realistic because there's really nothing special about the T20 when we stack it up against something more capable like, say, the Schiit Freya Plus. But the question isn't whether it replaces something like that. I think the question is how close can it come to the full experience of a full-featured preamplifier. Again, something like the Schiit Freya Plus, or even, sonically, how does it stack up against something like the Fosi Audio GR70, which I just reviewed? I think what's interesting about the T20 is its size and its flexibility. It's such a small component, and I think that for this size, this would make a great component for somebody that wants to have a more minimal system. Now, I'm personally in love with the features of the Schiit Freya Plus, and it offers almost infinite options, I think, to build out a system. Now, I don't think we get the same level of explicit flexibility here, but what we do get is the connectivity that matters the most. That makes the T20 a really interesting component, and especially for somebody looking to build out a very minimal footprint system, or even for somebody that just wants to get their very first preamplifier. I'll talk about my first impressions. I recently reviewed the Aiyima A80 as well as the Aiyima T8, so I was already familiar with the unboxing experience. And this was a very nice package put together. It was very open, clean, and simple and to the point. The box did take a little bit of damage in shipping, but the box did its job, and the device, I can happily say, is perfectly fine. This might be the nicest piece of Aiyima gear that I've personally reviewed so far. I think the chassis feels incredibly solid and well built. In terms of some of the other components that I've reviewed, I have to say that the build quality on this feels incredibly premium for this price point. This is a noticeable upgrade over the T8, especially when we compare something like the volume pot or even the display. I think that the display itself has a little bit more style to it, Yeah, I just visually think that it looks really great, and I love the front graphic here. I think it has kind of a pop art, modern kind of quality to it, which is very different from some of the more vintage aesthetic that is out there. So with that, I do think it has a lot of character in its design language, and I really think Aiyima here stepped up big time. So, I think the only missed opportunity here would be the ability to change the color of this LED. I know that's probably asking too much, but I do think it would be cool if I could get a nice kind of amber glow to match the tubes. I think that would look really cool. The volume knob is a very good stepped tactile kind of knob. It has a bit of weight to it, but again, this isn't an analog knob. This is going to be a digital knob. So it's kind of replicating what you would get on a more physical kind of knob. So, with that, the knob you can press it once to switch between XLR and RCA. And then if you hold down the button, you can turn the device on and off. Now, if we go around to the back, again, you'll see the XLR and RCA inputs. In addition to that, you get a trigger in and out, as well as the 12-volt power supply. Now, it does come with these really nice rubber feet on the underside, which I recently reviewed something that had some really bad plastic feet. And so this is a major step up from that because they're little metal cylinders with rubber inserts. Now, in terms of the tubes for the T20, this guy does use ECC 83 tubes, which are also could be considered 12AX7 tubes. And sorry if I'm misspeaking here, but as far as I know, these tubes are incredibly common to find. I had no trouble finding these. I should mention that the tubes that it comes with are PS Vane tubes. I have not had any issues with these tubes. I think they're really great for what you get here. I think, having said that, I would be very curious to see what happens with some tube rolling. And in the future, I think I will do that, and I'll post a review on that. But for now, for the purposes of this review, I'm going to be talking about it kind of in its stock form. So I think it's a question of, like, at $200, what is the T20's value proposition? And I think for me, first, it can work as a dedicated preamp. And so, like, in this setup, I'm using the T20 to feed a pair of Fosi Audio V3 mono blocks. And then I'm going to power those with a pair of ELAC Debut 3.0 speakers. So in this regard, the T20 becomes the volume control or that system hub. Now, when we compare this same setup to my Schiit Freya Plus with my line magnetic, now you're obviously not going to get the same number of inputs and the same number of features with the various gain settings. The Schiit Freya wins in that regard, and there's really no question about it. Because of its input and connectivity, it really is considered as a more full-fledged more as a full-fledged preamplifier of sorts. A second use case for this guy could be using it as a tube buffer. You might already have a preamplifier, but one of the things that you could do is just, drop this in between a DAC and an amplifier and, use that to kind of color your system if you wanted to. And, you could do this in a way so that each one of your sources has its own kind of tube buffer of sorts. So, you could use this as a preamplifier, but also I think if you're looking to kind of add tubes into maybe one source component, you could also use it in that regard. Now I'll talk a little bit about sound quality. So to test out the T20, as cleanly as possible, what I did was I used my topping D50 as my DAC along with my Blue Sound node, and I connected up the T20 in between my Fosi Audio V3 mono blocks with my KEF LS50s. Now, how I had this thing hooked up is through my D50, I'm running an RCA out to the T20 and then RCA back into the V3 monos. Then in addition to that, I'm taking a balanced XLR cable straight from the topping DAC to my V3 monos. So the difference is really a comparison of preamp stages on my DAC, which is the topping D50 version 3, and then the preamp stage in the Aiyima T20. Now, when we go back and forth here, kind of with the T20 and without the T20, I was actually surprised because I think that the differences here are very subtle. I was kind of hoping for more coloration and more differences with what this thing would produce, but I was actually surprised to find out that it's just an incredibly transparent preamplifier. So, without the T20 and just my topping D50, I tend to think the sound is drier and more crystalline. The vocals are going to sit slightly further back, and when we add the T20 into there, what we're going to get, I think, is a little bit more of the vocals being moved to the front, and there's also a little bit more of weight. Like the drums have a little bit more focus to them and a little bit more of an edge. And I think that there might be a slight expansion in the overall sound, like it is giving it some weight, but again, it's so subtle. And when I compare this to some of the other tube amplifiers that I've had, this is definitely not as dramatic as those. I mean, it should just be noted that, when we add tubes into the mix, what we are doing is technically adding some distortion. And we hope that that distortion is adding some good positive characteristics back into the track. And like typically for me, that's how I would feel about tubes. And so I do think that this maybe is doing something to the mix to make it a little bit smoother or maybe add a little bit more of expansion in the Soundstage. How much I think the tubes are doing that is a question that I think I can only really answer by going and then playing with a whole bunch of tubes. Because in some regard, I think some of those characteristics that I'm describing are just improvements that we're going to get with a preamplifier. Now, I think what's interesting here is that when I removed the T20, I found myself wanting to bring it back into the mix. And maybe that was just like psychoacoustics. I'm not really sure. I do think something meaningful is happening here. I don't think the T20 is considered a warm preamplifier. This isn't lushy or syrupy. It's not going to be any kind of, stereotypical tube sound. Instead, I think what we're going to get here is an incredibly transparent preamplifier with just ever so slightly a bit of sweetness on the top end. I do think that if you want a lot more color, you want that like EL34 tube-like experience, very warm, mid-range forward, then I think you might want to be looking for something else. If you are looking for a preamplifier, you think you still want it to be very transparent, and then maybe you want to have flexibility or options to swap tubes and op amps, then I think this could be a really great start. But just to kind of bring it back home, if you buy the T20, it's not going to come out of the box incredibly colorful, right? It's transparent, To compare this to the Fosi Audio GR70 that I just recently reviewed. Now, I love the GR70 and it's become one of my favorite components that I've ever reviewed. So, I think that the GR70 is much closer to what I'd call like a true tube sound. At least for me, the way I describe the GR70 is that it's lush and it's spacious and it's holographic. There is an incredibly live, realistic sound there that is very immersive and three-dimensional. When we compare that directly, the GR70 is more mid-range centric. It's less dynamic, I think, than the T20, right? The T20 is still full range dynamic. The GR70 is going to add a little bit of more weight and low end to the mix, where the T20 by contrast, again, is just more balanced across the frequency range. I don't necessarily think the T20 is like laser focused on any one frequency range. So there's a band called Kokoroko and they have an album called Could We Be More? And I think that the difference is especially clear in the horns here. The GR70 wraps them in warmth, whereas the T20 gives them this bite and this articulation. So if we're comparing like jazz, for example, and we're listening to the saxophone, when you listen to that saxophone on the T20, it's just going to have a little bit more of that edge and that kind of grating sense to it. Versus the GR70, it is more relaxed and more laid back. And I think that neither is really better, they're just different tools. So the GR70 is just going to introduce more color and a warmer tonality overall by design. And the T20 is going to stay relatively neutral and transparent. When we compare, say, the T20 to the Schiit Freya Plus, and we kind of go back and forth here with a track like A Horse with No Name, right? The T20 actually holds up better than I expected, because what separates the Freya Plus, I think, from the T20 is the sense of scale. Now, there's more air, there's more decay on the Freya Plus, and there's a deeper, more holographic soundstage, right? But the drums are more tangible there, and everything else kind of occupies its own space effortlessly. Now, the T20 is still giving me much of that, but to be realistic here, you're not going to get the same kind of sound. It's close, right? But for $200, we can't really expect to get the same performance of the Schiit Freya Plus. Now, when we compare this guy to something like the Aiyima T8, this is a really interesting one, because I think the Aiyima T8 is a warmer, more mid-range centric kind of preamplifier. And when I talked about that guy, I really talked about how great it was with kind of lo-fi vocal music, vaporwave, or even hip hop. The T20 by comparison is going to be a lot more transparency, and in my sense, there's a lot more detail coming through. That doesn't even mean that the T8 is bad, because again, I think that the T8 kind of has its place possibly for lower quality music. And it's just something to think about, right? Quick sidebar here, Aiyima has recently released an updated version of the A80, and I've already spent some time with it here. If you watched my original review of the A80 and you were on the fence, you'll definitely want to check out my follow-up of the Aiyima A80. I'll be releasing the updated A80 review here in just a couple days after I release this video, so it pairs really well with Aiyima T20, and if you're looking for an amplifier to pair with the T20, this could be an option for you. So if you're still interested in a compact modular system, keep an eye out for that one. Now I want to talk about the conclusion of the T20, okay? So, I've been genuinely impressed with the T20 when it comes to its build quality, its flexibility, as well as its connectivity. I think aesthetically, this is Aiyyima's best looking piece to date. And I think functionality-wise, it's neutral and it's transparent and it's very well executed. So, compared to the Freya Plus, I think the biggest difference is going to be its soundstage depth and its holography, or rather the Freya Plus just simply does more in that regard. But the T20 still gives you this meaningful taste of like what a preamplifier experience can be like. I think that especially in how this thing might encourage you to think about your system a little bit more deeply and possibly even just get creative with how you connect up your system, right? I've talked about this before, but I think with these smaller components, this really kind of changes how we go about building out systems. Nowadays we have DACs with multiple outputs, and we have phono preamps with multiple outputs. And I like to think about that in regards to, you could have a DAC and you could run one signal out to, a tube preamplifier. You could run one signal out to a solid state amplifier. And you could always switch between those two kind of flavors. And so I think that with these smaller components, they allow you to really use space efficiently and also create kind of a custom kind of experience. I think it's important to remember that this is a hybrid-based design. This is not a pure tube preamplifier, and that means that we're still going to get a bit of that kind of solid state characteristic. And I think with that, you're going to experience a little bit of that bite or that leading edge to tracks. It's still going to be very dynamic with some big dynamic swings. There isn't an excessive warmth here. There's not necessarily a collapsed soundstage. I think what really makes the T20 compelling is its adaptability, its ability to tube roll, its ability to change out the op amps. And of course, I think the balanced connectivity at this price point is a really awesome feature to have if you're looking for an affordable balanced option. So I think if you're curious about preamps, you're curious about tubes, you're thinking about getting a preamplifier, I would definitely recommend you check out the Aiyima T20, guys. I think that that's about all I can say here for the Aiyima T20. If you guys like this review, if you guys have any comments about the T20 and you want to voice those, please voice those down below in the comment box. Hit that like button and please subscribe. And also, please stay tuned because I'll be doing a little update on the Aiyima A80 and just talking about the features on that guy. So, thanks so much, guys. Bye-bye.